It is possible to become free from debt, financial worry, your boss, and your zip code. You can start living a life you love, but first, you need to find your freedom. Using financial independence and lifestyle design principles, you can create the life of your dreams now. There are many paths to freedom, and that is what this podcast is all about. My name is Becky from 20free.co, and I am the host of the Find Your Freedom podcast. Stephanie and Gillian are a Canadian couple who saved and invested their way to financial independence and retired early from their corporate careers in October 2019. Before achieving financial independence, they moved from Canada to Singapore to become expats. They retired just 2 years after learning about early retirement, even though they had never budgeted before starting their journey to FIRE. Now, they live a life of slow travel, exploring Europe and beyond with their 2 little dogs. Stephanie and Gillian were actually stuck in Italy during the height of the coronavirus outbreak there in March and April 2020. This was a fantastic, information-packed interview that I recorded with Stephanie and Gillian in April 2020. You may notice that this interview's audio quality is slightly lower than usual. The content of this interview is so valuable that I know you'll be able to overlook the audio quality and enjoy what Stephanie and Gillian have to say. Welcome to Find Your Freedom, Stephanie and Gillian.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for being here. So I want to start by talking about each of your backgrounds. Gillian, can you tell me a little bit about how your personal experiences have shaped your personality and perspectives on money and life?
Well, I'm not sure how far back we want to go. I guess if I could just kind of broadly paint a picture, I've been someone who has had a lot of different hobbies in life, different interests, and sort of a meandering journey along the way, going all the way back from being in a school for the arts. I then later went off and joined the military, which I spent quite a few years doing that, and I became a healthcare manager in the military. And then I eventually moved on to more healthcare jobs, working in quality improvement in healthcare. And that brought me all the way to meeting Stephanie, and eventually we moved our path into working in Singapore. I think I've sort of skipped through that really quickly, but maybe where the other part of your question about my sort of financial background, I would say that really came also from childhood, and I can thank my parents a lot for talking to me about money from an early age and helping me to understand concepts like saving and growing your savings. So that's something that started very early on and was something that I took with me through life, and can really thank my parents for that great start in that area.
So I heard that you were in the military. Did that help finance your education in any way?
Definitely. In fact, I was at Canada's Royal Military College, which offers students basically a full scholarship and also even a small stipend to cover, basic living expenses. So I actually finished my undergraduate studies without any debt. In fact, I had managed to tuck a bit of money away already at that point, which gave me a huge, head start coming out of school without carrying that debt.
That's such a good way for people to go to college without accruing debt. And then when you got out of college, were you into a military role for a certain amount of years after you graduated?
Yes. So I did have an obligatory service period, which was 5 years mandatory. I actually ended up staying a little bit longer than that because it was actually a great opportunity to be able to graduate and have a good job right off the bat, getting good experience. And I was working in a field where I was getting experience that I could apply later on, which I mentioned was healthcare. It was actually a perfect transition for me going through school to a job, and then to later on jobs where I could have more of a say over, what I was doing and where I was working.
Did you start investing into your retirement accounts when you started in your early financial life, when you began your career, or did that come later on?
I knew about registered retirement accounts from as early as I started investing. So it was something that I had in mind. I was definitely saving up in my early 20s and then into my mid 20s. I held off till then because I wanted to be in a slightly higher tax bracket so I could really leverage the potential savings from it. So in a way, I was investing, but I didn't actually move those savings into my retirement accounts until a little bit later to get the best tax advantage. But it was something I was doing effectively from as soon as I was earning a living.
Yeah, and so you were putting that money aside.
Yes, definitely.
And Stephanie, do you mind just giving me some insight into your background as well and your early financial life?
In terms of my background, I guess from a professional perspective, I was always very career focused. I put a lot of stock into upgrading my education, putting in a lot of extra hours, trying to be creative about developing my career. So that was all very important to me from a very early age. I was financially aware, but I would not say I was financially savvy. So I was aware enough to understand that it was be very important to me for some reason, some vague reason in the future, to have a retirement savings account. So when I got my very first job out of university, I started putting away a little bit of money every single month. So it was just $100, but I did it every single month. At the time, that was a lot of money to me. So it was a great habit, and it was one that I maintained over time. And eventually, I was able to put away a lot more than that. But the reason I say I was not savvy is because it wasn't until I met Gillian that I really started to appreciate that there was a lot more to financial management than just tucking a little bit of money away. So in fact, she taught me a lot about investing, and it was really her motivation that got us to the place where we are today. Because from my perspective, life was all about, putting your all into your career, and a career is something that you had in an organization, and you had to you find a ladder and you climb that one, and then you hop over to the next ladder and start climbing that one. So I was very much on a hamster wheel, and it had never occurred to me that there was another way to live life other than having a 9-to-5 job, until Gillian, who was the one who finally put her foot down and said, there's got to be another way. But fortunately, we both brought something to the mix. So even though she brought all the financial savviness, I was able to, have my good habits and then apply that to the new plan that we had moving forward, which was to have a different kind of life and a different approach to our finances.
And when did you two meet and start talking about finances with each other?
Oh, this is embarrassing.
2008?
So it was a really long time ago. Yeah. So we met, let's call it 2008, and then we got married 2 years later. And I think we were fairly open about our finances. Right in the beginning of our relationship, we impressed each other by being sort of practical people who were both very grounded when it came to finances. Again, Gillian was just that little bit level above me in terms of, she had seen that if she could go to, say, a military college, she could get her education paid for. I was still from the perspective, education is something you buy, and then you have to pay it off for 10 or 20 years after that. So again, she taught me a lot, but I think we came on a fairly, even balance between the two of us, and then sort of grew together over time.
That's great to hear that you were open about your finances with each other. And it sounds like you both had really good financial habits from an early age, which clearly served you in being able to retire early. So before we talk about your early retirement, you guys moved to Singapore and you lived there for over 6 years. So can you tell me, was this a career motivated move, or was it a lifestyle design motivated move, or a little bit of a mix of both?
So I will take credit for this one. So in my working career, I had always had a passion and an interest in working abroad. And I had spent many years trying to figure out how to make that happen. And I had thought, maybe, I could work at a company and they could transfer me, and that would be my gateway. We both love travel. We both love exploring the world. But for me, I always thought maybe I could use my career if I could just get over to another country. That would be a jumping point for seeing the rest of the world. And at some point, I just thought, no company is going to move me over. This is something that we need to do for ourselves. And we spent so many evenings and so many weekends networking with people, trying to find opportunities, doing informational interviews in this little country called Singapore, which I basically really hadn't heard of before. So I was scrolling through a list of all the countries in the world that speak English as a first language. And I thought, aha, here's one in Asia. Maybe this is a good place for us to focus on, because we don't have the pressure of learning another language, and we could hopefully move there and take our careers with us. And it turned out to be, in fact, a very dynamic part of the world. It's a very high growth market there. So even though it took us a number of months to sort of get all the networking part done, once we had an initial visit to Singapore and had some in-person interviews, we were very quickly offered jobs and were able to move, which was a huge, exciting development. And not only did it help push our careers forward, which was the initial impetus, but we also got to explore all of Southeast Asia, which was just the huge payoff for it.
What did that timeline look like from deciding, hey, I want to move out of the country, let's see how we can make this happen, to looking at the list and saying, Singapore, that sounds like a great place to go, and then actually moving?
The timeline was actually very fast. We actually had a trip planned where we were going to go to Tanzania. We were going to climb Kilimanjaro and go on safari. And then we thought, okay, why don't we tack on a visit to Singapore, this place we were thinking about trying to move to. And this was in February. So in February of that year, we made that visit. We came back feeling excited about the possibilities. The job offers soon followed. And we had actually sold our car, sold our house, and moved by June. So February, it all started. And then June, we were actually there in Singapore. So it was an extremely fast timeline, but it was, a very exciting time in life. And definitely that move to Singapore really set us up for the whole next chapter of our life. And really, I'd say, got us where we are today. To be honest, if we hadn't moved to Singapore, I don't think that our life would have followed the same path at all.
Really? That's so interesting to me. So that 4 months of decision to action changed the trajectory of your lives together. So can you tell me a little bit about this transition? You did a really quick transition from Canada to Singapore. Did you have to sell everything that you owned? What did that look like?
If only we were smart enough to know that we should sell everything we own. But we didn't know that.
No.
We thought, we're going to go to Singapore. Let's go for 2 years. Let's put everything we have into storage. Let's pay very high storage fees for a couple years while we see what it's like to live in another country. And then we can always change our mind and come back and pick up where we left off.
So you were hedging your bets a little bit, right? You didn't have to commit fully to life forever in Singapore.
Looking back, hindsight's always 2020. I think we did the right thing for us at the time. Had we known that we were going to be staying in Singapore and never relocating back to Canada permanently, well, of course we would have done something different. But, it was something very new for us, and we just decided to rent a furnished place. We were very happy there for the first few years. We did eventually ship our furniture over, and we were still in that mindset of being settled there. But at the same time, that's when we started having those discussions where we were saying, wow, we've kind of made it. We're earning good money, we're saving, but at the same time, we're really in the rat race. We're still feeling like we're in the grind, even though in theory, we're sort of like living the dream. I said, well, maybe we need to change our dream. Maybe there is yet another way of living. And that's when we started those discussions about what is our vision for the future and, what are the things we need to do to get there.
I will jump in and I'll say that initially, I was not open to those discussions. So as I said, I've always been a very career-focused person, and it's been hard for me to imagine what life looks like without having that career, without having a ladder to climb. So Gillian, on the other hand, was, her mind was opening. She was seeing people who are living differently. So once you're an expat living abroad, you start to see how other people are having different kinds of lifestyles. I was not ready to see that yet. It did take a year of really burning out at work. So I was in a very dynamic, competitive, fast-paced industry in Singapore. I was working many hours in the evening, through the weekends. So it really took that for me to say, we're living in paradise, but it doesn't feel that way. So maybe we need to make a change.
So that's really interesting to hear. On one hand, Gillian, you were seeing that your lifestyles could change and be different. But Stephanie, you were, before burnout, very career focused and on a typical 9 to 5 till 65 retirement pathway. So is this when financial independence entered your sphere of awareness and you started thinking maybe we should look at our finances and see if we can make this lifestyle, Gillian, that you were imagining a reality?
Definitely. That is the time we had started having those conversations. I think in the very beginning, when I started bringing up the idea that maybe at some point we would have enough saved that we could go and do something else, Stephanie would say, okay, fine. If we have $10 million, that will be enough. And of course, then you just say, okay, well, never mind. Like, let's not even talk about it. And then eventually I said, hey, instead of just saying a number, we need to think, okay, how much do we actually need to live on? Now, this was before we had actually come across the whole financial independence community. These were sort of independent thoughts we were having. So I guess I started looking online at that point, and it's when I uncovered some of the blogs from people that were quite relatable to us, who actually had pursued the path. I could say, hey, people are doing this. This isn't crazy. And there's actually research behind figuring out what is a relatively safe amount of savings to have and so on. So there was more than just, me saying, hey, let's do this. How much is enough? There was, more resources that we could draw on that I think really helped bring Stephanie into the conversation.
So when you started coming around to it, Stephanie, did you think that this was something that was still really far away for you when you were having these conversations? And give me an idea of what this timeline was like. When did you start having really serious financial independence, early retirement conversations?
I think that it was about 2 years before we actually retired. So that's when the concept first took shape a little bit and the research started coming to the fore, and we started reading every day. We were reading a different blog post and trying to understand the concepts. The next step was really when we got into understanding our spending, because we realized that we had no way of knowing how much we would possibly need if we didn't understand what we are actually spending today. And of course, today then meant that we were living in Singapore, which is an extremely expensive place to live, with highly inflated costs for literally anything you could possibly want to buy. So we just needed to understand what we're actually spending, because we literally had no idea. The money was just flowing out the door. Still, we did have very good savings habits in place. So we were still saving quite a bit, but we didn't really understand how much we were spending, where we're spending it, and how much we were truly saving.
Did you budget at all before you started on this path to financial independence?
I wish we could say yes, but the answer is no.
No. I think, because we were saving money, like every year we were saving money. So we thought, okay, well, as long as we're saving some, then we don't really need budget. But we didn't know how much we were saving. And I'm sure if we had been budgeting, then we would have been quite alarmed by our spending on some of the categories, which is basically what happened when we started to keep track. We were like, wow, we're spending a lot of money on takeout food, on dining out. That was one of our big categories we were spending on. We realized that our housing was more than what it needed to be, and that's an area that we needed change. So we just looked at the overall spending once we had a few months of data, and then just started thinking, which of these things can we cut back on? And we gradually shrunk our budget down. And as we're shrinking that budget down, we were realizing that we were like taking years of work away, and that became very motivating. And it almost became a game to see like, what are the things that we truly value enough that we want to keep it in our lives so that we continue working. And of course, there's certain things that you just don't want to do without, or you can't, of course. Everyone needs to meet their basic needs. But once you start thinking in terms of what you really value, that's sort of a paradigm shift instead of just, oh, what can I afford?
So when you were taking years away that you didn't have to work by downsizing and by cutting your expenses, do you have an idea of how many years you initially were at with your spending and you cut that down to 2 years to retirement?
Yes. So when we started, without putting really much thought into it, I sort of said, maybe we could do 5 years. I don't know, maybe 5. But then as we started working on the numbers, 5 peeled away very quickly. So we were quickly down to 4. And then as we were doing the budgets, it also became a game of how much longer can I possibly work? So, work was, as I said, it was very high pressure for both of us. In Singapore, it's a very strong work culture. So people are in the office very late hours. It's, that kind of thing is just expected. So as we were cutting our budgets at home, feeling pressure at work, the months that we were projecting that we would need to work suddenly, became a lot fewer. So in fact, our second last plan was to retire exactly at this time right now that we are talking to you. So April 2020, that was our last plan. But we kept playing with the numbers, and we were actually able to do it in October 2019, which thrilled us to no end.
Yeah. I think the other piece was we knew we weren't going to be retiring to Singapore. So while we were trying to reduce our costs in Singapore, we were also looking very closely at our future budget for what we wanted to be spending during the next part of our life, which we knew we wanted to be traveling, and we were hoping to spend at least part of the year in lower cost of living countries. So we knew our monthly cost would actually be quite a bit lower than what we were currently spending in Singapore. And so, yeah, we were spending quite a bit of time trying to dial in that budget and look for other people living a similar lifestyle so that we could see what their expenses are and really to fine tune that. So I think those two things were going at the same time, cutting our costs while looking at, okay, what is the budget we need? And eventually we were able to shrink down that amount of time that we had to work down all the way to almost around 2 years.
That's an incredible shift, too, from looking at the numbers at first and thinking 5 and then going down to 2. And it sounds like you were able to do that because you had a really specific goal and a specific vision of what you wanted. At that time when you were making this plan, did you know that you wanted to do long-term slow travel, or did that evolve as an idea for what your early retirement would look like as you were moving towards early retirement?
So it came through very quickly. So we were playing with different ideas, and we were trying to understand, could we live in a different part of the world, but we loved to travel, so we wouldn't really want to set down roots somewhere immediately. So the idea of traveling full time, it came up very quickly for us, and it was very strong because it was just tapping into our passion. It was why we moved to Asia to begin with, and it was what kept us there for so long, this chance to explore a totally different part of the world. It became our reason for what we were doing, why we were doing it. So truly, that was what motivated us through this whole period, which was, it had its own challenges in terms of trying to cut costs out, trying to make it through work every day. So that was what gave us the hope to carry on.
How did moving to Singapore affect your journey to FI? Was that financially impactful in any way?
Moving to Singapore, I really think it was the smartest thing we've ever done so far, aside from eventually achieving financial independence. So not only was it great for both our careers, it was great for opening our eyes and our minds to a wider world than what we would have experienced just in Canada. But from a financial perspective, it was really instrumental. So we were able to earn our income in a very low tax environment. And fortunately, because we are Canadians, so Americans don't get this benefit, but Canadians and some other nationalities do. We were able to become non-residents of Canada, and so we were no longer taxed in Canada. So we were just taxed in Singapore, which was amazing because it's a very low income tax rate. So we were able to take advantage of those financial benefits. I think generally getting paid at a higher level was great. Sometimes the differences in the exchange rate. So we're doing our investing back in Canada. So we're shifting money over at a time when the Singapore dollar was actually gaining on the Canadian dollar. So all of those factors combined to really take multiple years off our timeline. And I calculated it many times about how much more time I would have had to work in Canada. It fluctuated with every job, but the end result was that we were much further ahead. And it's actually for that reason, we've talked about this many times, that we would really, anyone who's thinking about maybe one day working abroad, I totally recommend it because it just gives you so much in terms of life experience and work experience, but also there can be a huge financial benefit as long as you avoid some of the expat traps, because it can be a very spendy environment. Costs can be inflated. If you are an expat coming into a place, you might end up renting a nicer place than you normally would. You could end up spending a little bit extra on weekend trips in Thailand, which are wonderful, but they do add up. So those were all things we needed to navigate in our first number of years there and eventually really cut down on so that we could see the financial return that we were looking for.
I'm glad that you mentioned the expat cost traps, because on one hand, a lot of people think about moving to Asia for the geo arbitrage, which gives you a lot of different options, whether it's exchange rates or lower costs of living. but you actually moved to Singapore, which is a higher cost of living, as I understand it, than Canada or the United States. So there are some ways in which your lifestyle can be easily inflated over what you're used to if you're not careful. So can you tell me about a couple of the ways that once you started tracking your money and where it was going, you were able to reel in those expenses and decrease your timeline to financial independence?
I think one of the places which I mentioned, but definitely was the most important one that we had to make changes was our eating habits and our eating out habits. So Singapore really has an eating out culture. Generally, people will eat 2 or even 3 meals a day out. And sometimes they're the sort of lower cost lunch, grab and go, but also it's very easy to spend quite a lot of money on dinners out or more nicer takeaway meals that can add up to quite a bit of money. So that was one area where we were spending that we were able to adjust and start cooking at home a whole lot more. And we saw a huge difference in that. Another area where we definitely spent money, but one I will say that I don't regret, and that is the travel opportunities. So there are a lot of low-cost flights to different places across Southeast Asia, and those weekend getaways were something that I think we got a lot of enjoyment out of. But at the same time, you can spend a lot on those trips or you can spend a little. So I will say for us, we managed to keep the cost of those trips fairly reasonable. I would definitely say we have some friends who managed to really let it take a bigger bite out of the budget. So that's an area where you're still on your path to financial independence. Keep it in a range, whatever range is comfortable for you, and don't let it slide, because it's not just about the final destination.
I love that message, though, that you didn't have to scrimp and save every cent so that you could accelerate your timeline to FI. You were able to balance your desires of travel with your desire to save that money and be able to travel more, honestly, after you retired, right? So you weren't going on these crazy expensive vacations, but you were getting out and exploring Asia and the areas that were close to you and doing that on a more budget-friendly way. Did you also downsize where you were living in order to decrease your expenses?
We certainly did. So in our last year, so this was a run up to finally leaving, when we got really serious about cutting costs, and we wanted to cut those costs to the bare minimum, because we could see, as we talked about before, the more we were cutting costs, our net worth was growing, and the number of months we would have to work was shrinking. So we made a lot of huge changes. One of those big changes was we finally said goodbye to living in a 2-bedroom apartment in a lovely area in Singapore. So rents are very expensive there. We had always had a 2-bedroom because we did expect to host family while we were living in Singapore. And yes, family did come and visit us, but you know what? They weren't there every weekend. So we were subsidizing this very large space that got used, maybe a few weeks out of the year. So we finally made the decision to downsize that quite dramatically. We saved tons of money, not just on the apartment, but we actually moved closer to our workplaces. So suddenly our transportation costs also disappeared. Suddenly our utility bills got so much smaller because we didn't have to cool an entire place. We didn't have to have water running for 2 bathrooms, which again, we really didn't need. So that was one of the big, moving is never convenient, but it had major payoff right away.
Yeah, and it seems like you saw that money that was not being spent anymore going towards those months that you didn't have to spend anymore. So your time and your money were tied together, and you were seeing that relationship really clearly when you were making these decisions. I just think it's so interesting to hear you recap your thought process there. And you were within a year of retirement at that point. So did that last year before retirement look really different than when you were living in Singapore before, because you were working towards that goal, you were so close, and you were also probably changing your life a little bit in preparation to transition to full-time slow travel?
It did really look different. So I mentioned how much we had enjoyed travel while in Singapore. Well, during that last year, we decided to pretty much forego travel, and we focused our weekends on coming up with DIY projects, spent a lot of time learning things that were going to be saving us money and became hobbies in the process. So for example, I would spend a weekend learning how to groom the dogs, and then suddenly that's a savings of the rest of their haircuts for the rest of their life. I'm not sure if we've mentioned on the podcast yet, but we are traveling with our two dogs. Learning to be able to do all their maintenance was one of the ways we saved money.
That's right. So our last year, we were playing podcasts about financial independence almost nonstop in our house. We had projects going all over the place. Gillian was running off to bulk stores to buy massive amounts of food so we could really frugalize that way. We were trying all kinds of crazy experiments. We replaced all our paper towels with cloth, like large things, small things. We gave up our boutique CrossFit gym that cost so much money every single month, and we learned how to do our training ourselves. So again, we were like slashing costs every which way. It was almost just this nonstop race because we could see the finish line, and every month that went by, we were so much closer. We were selling every stick of furniture that we had. We were getting rid of everything that we owned. So just the closer we got to that deadline of early retirement over the course of the year, the activities just accelerated.
There were all these successive waves of downsizing. So during that last year, we did have one trip back to Canada to sort through that storage locker. We still had 10 by 10 storage locker that we knew had tons of stuff in it that we just didn't need to keep. So we were able to downsize that to something just very small enough to keep those mementos that we need somewhere in the world to keep. But back in Singapore, we of course downsized from the 2-bedroom to the 1-bedroom. That meant selling off stuff. And then, of course, in the final push to leave Singapore, we sold or gave away everything aside from what we're now traveling with in 2 large suitcases.
That's incredible. And that's a big shift. So what I'm also hearing is that you don't have a home base necessarily anywhere in Canada or in Singapore where you're storing your items or your furniture. You really did go full nomad, and you have that small amount of storage for the mementos, and everything else is in your 2 suitcases, your 2 backpacks, and your 2 dogs.
That's exactly the way I would summarize it.
Yeah, and it's incredibly liberating, the feeling. I think I struggled with it maybe a little more than Stephanie, although I think we each had our moments. And it would be, I would look at like one item and I'd say, oh, but this item, maybe I can keep this item or that item. But in the end, it felt so much better to just have like really what we need with us. And any of those things, it's just stuff. It might be something that's beautiful. It might be something, that gave me a warm feeling to look at. But like what Stephanie said to me, say if it was it had been a gift from someone, she'd say that the meaning in that is your relationship with that person, not the item that the person gave to you. It was not an easy process, the downsizing, but now we feel so light and free. And, you can always buy something again if you need it. But so far, we've been enjoying keeping it light 6 months later. And I think we're still downsizing a little here and there, and definitely not in the process of reaccumulating things.
In October 2019, you said goodbye to your jobs. What did that process look like in Singapore? Do you give 2 weeks notice? Did you tell people that you were retiring?
I wish it was 2 weeks notice. In Singapore, it's 2 months notice.
Yeah.
So we each had to give our full 2 months notice. So that was very interesting. For me, I put in a very solid effort for my first month of notice. So I was making sure I was handing over the projects. I was there at every meeting. But by the second month, I felt like my job was sort of done. At that point, my primary focus was really on the downsizing and preparing to leave. Gillian is a much better employee than I was, right?
Yeah, I was actually putting in my full effort literally until the day that we flew out of Singapore, because just how it turned out, my last day of work was the day we were going to be flying off. So that was just a crazy, crazy day where I was, wrapping things up at work, making sure all my handover tasks were all laid out, and then coming back, closing up the suitcase and getting on a plane. So yeah, that was a really dramatic end to our time in Singapore. And yeah, very exciting start to our new life.
And at what age did you guys retire?
I was 38 and now I'm 39.
And I was 46 and now I'm 47.
That's incredible to, in 2 years, say, we want to retire, to being able to retire, and you're in your 30s and 40s, and now you're transitioning to full-time travel. I think that's a really promising story for you to share with everyone. I think a lot of people think that you have to have this plan from your early 20s to say, I'm going to save all this money, and so I can retire early, and so I can live this lifestyle that I want. And it's really awesome to see that you almost flipped the script, where you started living a different lifestyle and you tested out the expat lifestyle and you started doing that travel through Asia and then said, hey, what if this could become our lives? You made it happen. And in 2 years, you were able to implement the financial independence, retire early model.
It's been pretty exciting for us as well. Thank you.
You packed up in October 2019 to slow travel Europe. You gave your notice and you got on the plane your last day of work, Gillian. What did you do after that? Where did you go? What did slow travel end up looking like for you?
So the first place we started our slow travel journey was Poland, and we were there for just a couple weeks. It was a bit shorter than our subsequent stops. Because we are slow traveling, we like to be a month in each place. But the way it worked out was our first chunk of time, we actually had a bit more time than a month. So we decided to go to 2 places. So we spent a few weeks in Krakow, and then we spent a couple of weeks in Lviv, Ukraine. Then by that time, the weather was starting to cool down and we wanted to be a little bit warmer. So we headed south down to Turkey, where we spent a month in Istanbul, and then a nice 6 weeks along the Turquoise Coast, which is a part of Turkey that I hadn't heard of before we started traveling. But it's just beautiful, like Mediterranean climate. So fairly comfortable through the winter. There's hiking there, there's mountains in the background, and of course the Mediterranean Ocean. So yeah, it was just a wonderful start to our travels. And then we landed in Italy, where we had planned to be for 2 months. And so we were in Florence for 1 month. And that's when things started getting a little bit crazy, because we were hearing about these cases of the coronavirus outbreak in the north of Italy. Yeah, and then things got a little nutty from there.
So what were your original plans? You were going to be in Italy for 2 months. You were in the city of Florence. Were you also going to go to a different region in Italy while you were visiting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we were spending a month in Florence, so February in Florence, and then March in Lecce, which is in the south of Italy. And then we had these wonderful, elaborate, exciting plans. We were going to take a boat across to Croatia. We were going to spend a month in Croatia. And then we were just going to spend the spring and the summer having a very slow, leisurely exploration of the Balkans. Well, none of that is, of course, turning out as we had hoped.
So when did you start hearing about this news, and how quickly did the situation evolve for you? I know Italy was ahead of the United States and Canada in terms of their cases becoming very serious and the travel restrictions becoming very strict. So can you give me some insight into what that timeline looked like?
We were hearing about the cases while we were in Florence, in the Lombardy region up in the north, but we made our way down to Lecce, where we were going to be spending the second month. And we'd only been there for about a week when there were some signs telling us like maybe we should be taking this whole thing more seriously. Stephanie had gone to the gym and found the gym had closed, and saying, oh, we've decided to close our operations. And we're like, okay, even though the lockdown has started in the north, we didn't realize we were going to be affected. Now, looking back, that was just foolish, because the very next day, the actual lockdown of the whole country was announced. And that's the moment when we spun into action. We knew we needed to leave Italy right away if we were going to be able to at all. And so we actually booked a flight out to Hungary, which was one of the few countries that hadn't closed its borders already. But unfortunately, in the time, like in the 24 hours from when we booked the ticket and when we were due to fly the next morning, the borders for Hungary had also closed. So we knew right then and there, okay, we're going to be in Italy. We figured we were just going to wait things out in Italy, because clearly we weren't going to be able to travel around in Europe.
Did you have the thought cross your mind that you should head back to Canada, or were you just looking to get out of what was the epicenter of the COVID-19 crisis in Europe, which was Italy?
To be honest, we were looking back now, as Gillian said, I mean, we were very naive. like a lot of travelers, I've heard very few stories of people who really grasp the urgency of the situation in the moment. So like a lot of people, we didn't take it seriously enough. Our plan was never to come back to Canada, so that did not cross our mind for quite some time. We thought all we need to do is make it out of Italy and get to another part of Europe because that's where we want to be. If we had been thinking at all properly about it, we would have understood this is a virus. It is traveling without regard to borders. This is going to affect everywhere. So things just escalated more quickly than we were able to process it and to react. So we were very fortunate in that Gillian had a friend with a holiday home by Lake Como, and we were able to, just as our flight was canceled to Hungary, within a half an hour, we were able to make alternate arrangements and actually end up in a very beautiful place. But in fact, it was the epicenter of the outbreak. So while we were safe and comfortable there, we were in a highly locked down region where people were taking things very seriously, and there were ambulance sirens almost every day. So it was a very serious place to be, but we felt grateful to be there because we were unsure where else we might go. And it was only in the subsequent days after we landed there and we're taking stock of the situation that we realized, wait a second, the only country where we'll actually be welcomed right now is Canada. So that's where we need to be.
I'm so glad to hear that you were able to find a place to stay, even though you did end up in the epicenter in Italy, that you were safe and you were housed, because I remember hearing about your situation when it first happened, when you were unable to leave and you were figuring out what was next. And I was thinking, what happens when you cancel your Airbnb because you're going to get on a flight to Hungary, and then the flight to Hungary gets canceled, and now you're looking for a new place to stay in a country that you haven't spent all that much time in. I can imagine that was a very challenging and quickly changing time for both of you. Once you settled, how did you stay safe and healthy when you were in Lake Como?
We had a whole day on the train as we headed north to figure out exactly how we were going to manage things. So we knew our main activity would be to get ourselves all stocked up with groceries so that we could really be isolated in our little place up in the mountains. So we got a rental car for 24 hours so that we could fill the trunk twice and get the freezer and fridge all stocked up so that we were really able to be isolated and comfortable there in Lake Como. And that turned out to be, I think, a great move because it meant we weren't really having to interact with anybody. And in fact, we were in a very scenic location. So we really had nothing to complain about, especially since we were able to keep ourselves isolated.
What was life like in Lake Como when you were there for that month? Were you just inside of the home that you were staying in, or were you allowed to go outside at all? What was your lifestyle at that point?
Fortunately, because the location was so isolated, we were in this tiny little village. On paper, it said there were 500 residents, but I mean, I don't know where they were because we hardly saw anybody around, and we were up near the very top of the village where the homes ended and a bit of farmland started, kind of going up the mountains, sort of these terraced farms. So it was actually quite lovely for us to be able to walk up there every day. We could walk up with our dogs and let them run around, have a sniff. We would take a seat and just kind of look out over the lake and the mountains, and it was incredibly picturesque. So we were so grateful to be able to get out, get some air, especially when in Italy they eventually said, you're really not supposed to go outside at all, aside from one member of the household can go to get food or to pick up prescriptions, but that was it. And then if you have a dog, that you could walk up to 200 meters with your dog. So fortunately, we have 2 dogs, so we could each take one dog, go 200 meters to the little fields there, and we could sit down and still not be breaking any rules, but be getting, a lovely breath of fresh air. And so that's really how we enjoyed our time, cooking good meals, reading, and taking short dog walks.
Well, it's good to hear that you could get outside, together. That's another benefit of traveling with your dogs, probably an unanticipated benefit, but definitely that you could both go out and walk the dogs together. I did want to touch really quickly, too, on traveling with 2 dogs. What has that experience been like? Because it seems like it would add an extra layer of planning and complication that would be needed. But on the other hand, sounds amazing to have, your furry best friends with you everywhere you go.
Absolutely, more complication, also more expense. It's more limiting to travel with dogs. You can't take those extremely cheap budget flights because the budget airlines won't accept pets in cabin. So a lot of restrictions. You need to be aware of cultural restrictions when you're going places. They can't necessarily go in every restaurant with you. But all that aside, it is so much fun. We just love it. And it just comes with so many benefits. So not only do they make every place we go feel like home, but it's also such a great way to connect with locals. So before we had the virus situation, everywhere we would go in every country, people would come up to us. They would want to open a conversation with us, find out about the dogs. Sometimes people thought we were locals and asked us for directions. So we just really felt very comfortable there. It really helped make each place that we stayed in. So we would stay for a month and we would build a whole routine around dog walking and the places we would go. And it made it feel really like we lived there, which was a great feeling when you travel.
I think the fact that we're slow traveling is really the thing that makes it possible. It just wouldn't be realistic to be moving around, every few days with a pet. It's just not fair to them. But with the 1 month, you can really settle into a routine. And the other thing is we're fortunate to have dogs that are small enough that they can travel in the cabin of planes with us when we do need to fly. So it's just, less stressful for them and less stressful for us. But most of the time we do travel by train, which is our preferred way to travel. And that's just the best, where you can, just relax on the train and the dogs can watch the countryside go by. And it's almost like those that make those small hassles all worthwhile.
That's a great point, that doing overland travel as well is a completely different way to experience travel with your pets without, I think a lot of people think that you have to, put them on the plane with you and you have to be flying everywhere. But I'm sure it's much more comfortable for everyone involved if you're on a train and they can just have their own seat, right? How long did you initially plan to stay in Lake Como, or were you taking it a day at a time because the virus situation was evolving and changing very, very rapidly?
When we arrived there, we had no idea how long we might stay. One of our concerns is that our Schengen visas would be running out by the end of April. We quickly did that math to figure it out. The friend that had lent the home, certainly it was open-ended. Had we needed to stay there for months, I'm sure it would have been not a problem. But of course, we knew we would have to leave the country and, in fact, that Schengen region at some point fairly soon. So it was over the discussions about where to next. We should go to Canada. Okay, how can we possibly get there? And we started to research flights. So in the end, the amount of time turned out to be a month, which was a good amount for us to at least feel settled for bed and kind of chill out after the couple days of craziness trying to get away from the major urban centers. And then we were able to wait out that time and finally make our way back to Canada.
And did you take a repatriation flight? How did you figure out your pathway home? Because I know a lot of people who were trying to get back home to Canada or to the United States were having difficulty booking flights, especially out of certain regions.
So I think we're quite fortunate in that Air Canada has been keeping a flight between Toronto and Frankfurt. They've been keeping it open, running it daily, sometimes with very few passengers. In fact, the day that we flew had only 15 passengers on a plane built for 380. So it was quite something. We were able to catch that flight, and to get there, we just had a hop from Milan to Frankfurt. So it was actually a fairly smooth commute back.
Yes.
So yeah, we were very lucky. We didn't have to jump through all kinds of crazy hoops. And because we were able to settle and plan our trip back, we could also choose a date when the prices weren't insane, because they were really extreme the first few days when everything was going crazy. And then they actually settled down to a fairly reasonable price point, which certainly helps the budget when, you're having this flight that you never expected thrown in, and also, suddenly facing Toronto level living expenses, which also was not something that we had exactly planned for the budget.
I love that. How far in advance were you planning when you were in Europe? Did you have 6 months to a year of travel plans to cancel, or just a couple of steps ahead?
Fortunately, we had made a decision after starting out in our travels. So we are planners. We love planning ahead. I think that is probably very clear. When we started off on our journey, we immediately locked down the first 6 to 8 months. We're like, let's get those Airbnbs booked, let's get our bus tickets booked, trains, etc. And we discovered very quickly along the way that that was not a good idea because it did not leave a lot of room for spontaneity, which is not something we've traditionally been very good at. But now that we're retired, we need to take more opportunities in life to do things a little bit more differently. So we started to experiment with changing our plans around a little bit to take advantage of opportunities to meet up with people, just to be a bit more flexible. So fortunately, by the time the crisis hit in March, we had only planned and booked a couple months ahead. And those were bookings that we were thankfully able to get refunded, which was great. But it was good we had learned that lesson earlier on because we are the type of people that normally would have had that whole year planned. And just we had learned enough in our first 6 months of travel to realize let's keep a little bit more open space in the schedule.
Especially since, like you said, you had all of this freedom in retirement, so you didn't need to be so scheduled out. I totally relate to wanting to schedule everything ahead of time. I'm a complete planner as well. So in this kind of scenario, though, you saw a huge benefit in being more flexible, in having a little bit less invested in your plan for the future because it helped you be a little more nimble in changing those plans when you had to. How financially did this unexpected crisis affect you, and how were you prepared for, unexpected emergencies in your finances?
There are many layers to it in terms of an answer. So there was the immediate crisis of having to cancel all of our bookings, rebook things, and try to leave. So fortunately for those immediate emergencies, much of it was refundable. Thank goodness. And we were able to get back the vast majority of all of the things that we had either had to abandon or were canceled or future plans that were affected. So that worked out quite well. And then, of course, we do keep an emergency fund portion within our budget. So that was able to absorb the flight back to Canada. And more generally, in terms of the market situation and where that seems to be going, we did plan for this as part of our overall retirement planning. So, of course, never a great time to be retiring in the midst of a market crash, not what we were expecting to be doing, but we certainly had a plan in place for ensuring that our cash flow would be protected. So you can pick that one up.
Sure. So I never liked the idea of just having to sell off equities month by month or a year ahead at a time and see that bite out of your net worth kind of like that, because it made me very nervous with the markets going up and down. So when we were trying to figure things out, I wanted to engineer some way that we would have an ongoing cash flow coming into our bank to sort of replace those salaries that we were used to seeing. So what we did was we have a mix of both equities and fixed income investments. And the fixed income returns are what fund our day-to-day expenses. That's what we live off. So our equities were actually not touching at all at this juncture. So even though they have dropped in value, we're just not looking at it. They're going to come back over time. At this point, we aren't having to sell off at that lower value, which I think is a great weight off our mind.
That's really interesting to hear because some people hedge against sequence of returns risk, which is what you're facing right now, where in the first year or potentially several years of your retirement, you could face lower returns. You are able to not have to lock in your losses on your equities by selling them in order to fund your lifestyle. You're able to use that fixed income. Other people choose to have, 2 to 5 years of cash on hand for their living expenses in order to hedge against that risk. So can you give me a little more background into your fixed income and where that comes from? I think most people probably think bonds when they hear that, but from what I've read on your blog, that's actually not what you're invested in.
I think for our fixed income, we really needed something that was going to provide a bit higher return than what people most typically would think of, such as bonds. So something that we have been investing in for quite a few years are syndicated mortgages, which basically means it's a large mortgage. Often it's related to a construction mortgage, maybe of a large, townhouse or it's a large enough mortgage that it can actually be split up amongst different lenders. So we basically hand select these deals so that we can look at all the details exactly to help us understand the risk that we're taking on by lending this money. But I think what I really like about the syndicated mortgages is that they're backed by real estate. There's a property there. So although property values do go up and down, unlike equities, there is something really tangible that will be there. So in that way, for me, it's a bit of a diversification away from just the equities market. It also gives us a foothold in some real estate without just holding a single property. So those are what we receive interest payments from those loans. We have many different loans so that once again, it's diversified. Yeah, those are our fixed income investments.
Sorry, I also just wanted to really quickly add that we also have a cash buffer available. So we have 1 year's living expenses available in cash that we maintain, so that we have a very balanced approach to our risk management.
And that's really what everyone who is approaching FIRE needs to think about, is what their risk management strategy looks like and what seems right for them. Some people go for like cash flow instead of having to sell off their assets. And that sounds like a little bit what you're doing. But most of the cash flow FIRE folks that I've talked to actually own their own rental properties. And so they're landlords and they have to deal with property management. So this is a really interesting idea for someone who doesn't feel like they want to be owning single properties. They don't want to have to deal with tenants or broken toilets or whatever, a way to have a foothold in the real estate market without having a lot of the headaches that could come potentially with that.
Yeah, it's an interesting alternative. I think we all know that returns don't come without risk. And so the reason I bring that up is because I wouldn't encourage someone to just blindly start lending money without really understanding the deals that they're getting involved with. But if you can educate yourself to understand what to be looking for in terms of the loan amount compared to the value of the property, if you can read all the details of the person that you're lending to really understand if they have the financial footing that you would hope in order to be making the investments they're making, because you're really putting some trust in there. If you can do all that, then it is definitely an attractive option.
Yes. And have you seen any impacts with COVID going through basically all of the facets of the market right now? Any impacts in the real estate industry with that type of asset that you're investing in, with perhaps people not being able to continue their construction projects or anything that would be affecting your income potentially in the future?
Yes. I mean, like every part of the economy, I think that real estate and construction will certainly be impacted, which is where our 1 year cash buffer is definitely going to be there to help us manage through this time. So I do think that we will see some uneven interest payments over the times ahead. There could even be some circumstances where properties could need to be foreclosed upon if it's not possible to keep the investment. But overall, I feel comfortable with the approach that we have and the risk mitigation strategies we have in place.
Thanks for sharing that. So let's get to where you are now. Where did you land in Canada? Are you renting in a more long-term capacity? Are you still on short-term rentals? I know Airbnb is usually your platform of choice when you were traveling in Europe. What does that look like for you right now?
Sure. So we are not willing to commit to a life without travel yet. So we have come back to Canada and we're happy to be here because we're happy to be supporting our family, giving them moral support at this time. Everyone's very concerned. So both of our families are based in Toronto. So we are here in an Airbnb in Toronto and we are taking it month to month. So our hope is that borders will reopen eventually, and we are willing to be right there to hop onto those opportunities when they do, because we still have our passion for travel, and it's very much how we see ourselves. And this time in our life of this journey is about discovery and travel. So we're going month to month in different Airbnbs and trying to have a local travel experience, if you will. So we are planning to maybe spend a couple months in Toronto now, and then maybe we might relocate to other cities within Canada as the time ticks by. So we're leaving that open. Toronto is also a very high cost of living place. So we would like to explore a couple other markets in Canada. We haven't actually, well, I haven't lived in other cities in Canada. Gillian has. So it could be an interesting time for me. It's not a time to be out and about and enjoying things because we all are supposed to be socially distancing. But, within our opportunity, we will try to, see a little bit more of the city through our dog walks and, while we are responsible and in maintaining our distance.
And what does your long-term early retirement plan look like? Were you thinking of doing slow travel for basically ever, or did you have a time limit? Maybe it would be a couple of years and then you would settle down. What did that look like when you were planning your early retirement?
I think we just want to keep things really open. This time was really to explore different places and as well how we like to live. And so as we move through different countries, it's also a chance to kind of try on different lifestyles and see what feels right for us. I wouldn't be surprised if we at some point slowed down a little bit more to spend a little longer in different places. And there may be even places that we cycle back to spend time, maybe certain seasons. But, I see no reason to come up with a plan that's fixed now because we're very free to explore and see what's right for us as we go along.
Are you ready for some rapid fire questions?
Sure. Ready.
So what does freedom mean to you?
So freedom for me, it means a chance to just discover the world, just to explore everywhere. And of course, right now we're facing travel bans, but one day those will be gone and we can get back at it. I was just saying to Gillian earlier today that there was nothing like arriving in a new country and the excitement and the wonder and knowing that we would be there for a whole month and we could really get to know it. It was just so great to have that every single month, a new place, a new adventure. So that's really, for me, that's what freedom means, is just to savor that.
What would you do if you could never retire?
Oh gosh, well, if I could never retire, I think I'd be really focused on making my pre-retirement life everything that I dream it could be. And in fact, I think that's something that we really did try to do. There's no point making all your actions all about the future because, when you get there, it might look different. So you really need to find a way to enjoy your everyday life. And so whether just because you're not retired doesn't mean that you can't, have a life of your dreams. So I would focus on making that happen.
Lifestyle design. I love it. That's what I'm all about. And Stephanie, if you could go back in time, what one piece of lifestyle or financial advice would you give yourself in your early 20s?
Such a good one. I would say to myself, please, whatever you do, track your spending. It was the one thing, it was the foundation to everything else. The money used to just fall out of my hands. I just never knew where it went. And to be honest, we were never big spenders. We've both always been just naturally frugal people. And yet still, you make so much money over the years. Where does it all go? So that would be the one thing I would tell myself, that you really need to track your spending.
Great. And actually, Gillian, I'd love to hear your answer to this question as well. What piece of advice would you give yourself in your early 20s?
I made a lot of decisions in life based on what would provide me a very secure future. And usually that security came in the form of, the most financially practical. And although some of the actions that I took were things that got me to where I am today, I would actually go back and tell myself to feel free to live my life based on like my passions, because, you only get one life. And so I knew that there would always be that part of me that would be practical, but infusing that passion in life along the way is really what makes life worth living. So that's what I would tell myself.
I love that advice from both of you. From Stephanie, we got a really great piece of financial advice. From Gillian, a great piece of lifestyle advice. I think that wraps this interview up perfectly. So thank you, both of you, Stephanie and Gillian, for being on this podcast with me today. Where can people go to find out more about you and your story?
So we have our website, which is ourfreedomyears.com. Most of the action, however, takes place on our YouTube channel. So it's Our Freedom Years, and we have a new video every Thursday, and we talk about how-tos for financial independence, slow travel, early retirement, and even a little bit about travel with dogs.
Great. And you guys are on Instagram as well?
Yes, we're on Instagram as well.
At Our Freedom Years. So we'll link to all of that in the show notes for this episode. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having us. Yeah, we really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
To check out the show notes for this episode, which includes links to resources mentioned in today's interview and where you can learn more about Stephanie and Gillian, go to 20free.co/episode 18. I want this to be more than just a podcast for listening to, so I'm making it a do-cast, where you're getting information from the podcast that you can take action on to create real outcomes in your life. I call these power moves. If you implement even one of these tactics into your life, you're taking a powerful step towards finding your freedom. What are some power moves we learned from this conversation? Here are 6. Power move number 1, create good financial habits. If you create good financial habits, your journey to financial independence will feel almost effortless. Good financial habits include paying yourself first, which means putting aside money for savings and investments before spending anything. It also means spending less than you earn and avoiding bad debt and lifestyle inflation. If you build a good base of good financial habits, your path to financial independence can be relatively smooth. Stephanie and Gillian didn't ever budget before they decided to retire early, but they were still able to retire in just 2 years because of their base of strong financial habits. Power move number 2, have a vision for early retirement. This will motivate you when things get tough. For Stephanie and Gillian, they could see that cutting their expenses meant fewer months of work, and that they were getting even closer to their dream of slow traveling through Europe. Pursuing early retirement just to escape from work often isn't enough motivation to make the hard decisions that need to be made. But working diligently towards a vision for a better life in the future can really motivate you to make the tough choices and work hard towards your goals. Power move number 3, earn and save more overseas. Want some adventure while also earning and saving more? Move abroad. Expats in countries that have lower cost of living or higher salaries when converted in a favorable exchange rate can accelerate their timeline to early retirement. This is called geo-arbitrage. Stephanie and Gillian earned higher salaries while experiencing a lower tax rate while living and working in Singapore compared to their home country of Canada. Plus, they were able to take budget trips to explore Southeast Asia once they relocated. How do you get a job overseas? You don't necessarily need an employer to relocate you. Instead, try what Stephanie and Gillian did. They networked, made a lot of connections, did informational interviews over the phone, and then visited Singapore while they were traveling to see if they could imagine living there. The total time for them between deciding to move to Singapore and actually getting on the plane was only 5 months. Power move number 4, downsize your housing. Moving into a smaller living space will downsize your budget too. Moving can also shorten your commute if you go somewhere closer to work, and therefore reduce your transportation costs. Do you really need a 2-bedroom apartment because friends and family might come to visit once or twice a year? Should you subsidize that cost all year round for that possibility? Stephanie and Gillian decided the answer was no, so they downsized from a 2-bedroom to a 1-bedroom and moved to an area where they could walk to work. Having a smaller living space also means having lower utility bills because you're paying to heat and cool a smaller area. Power move number 5, keep travel slow and flexible. Slow travel is the practice of staying in one place for several weeks to several months. It's the opposite of those breakneck vacations where you have 1 week off from work and want to see absolutely everything that a whole country has to offer. So you run from one attraction or town to another, ending up more exhausted at the end of your vacation than you were when it started. With slow travel, you can settle into an area and really get to know the locals, the culture, and the lifestyle of the area you are visiting. Flexibility with travel is also important. Like Stephanie and Gillian, I am definitely a planner. They initially planned 6 to 8 months ahead for all of their travels, but this left them with little flexibility to stay somewhere longer if they really liked it, or to go somewhere else with friends they met. Luckily, they learned not to plan so far in advance and to keep things more flexible. So they only had about 3 months of travel plans to cancel when the coronavirus completely canceled the rest of their travel plans. Power move number 6. Now is the best time to start. I frequently hear people lament that they've started their path to financial independence and early retirement, quote unquote, too late. But the earliest you could start is right now. Stephanie and Gillian didn't start explicitly working towards early retirement until 2 years before they actually retired. Gillian was 38 and Stephanie was 46. Good habits over the years combined with FIRE-oriented budgeting in the last 2 years shrunk their timeline to retirement by several years. If you are inspired by their story, you should start now. Build those basic financial habits if you're just beginning your financial independence journey. If you're further along, you should start considering out-of-the-box options to accelerate your timeline to early retirement, such as moving abroad to take advantage of geo-arbitrage. That is the sixth and final power move from this interview with Stephanie and Gillian. Like to travel? You can find a free download of our pre-travel and post-travel checklist in the show notes at www.20free.co/episode 18. Need someone to talk to about recent changes in your finances due to COVID-19? Connect with me on a free 10-minute coaching call at 20free.co/moneycoaching, and we'll discuss how I can help. That's the word 20, free.co/moneycoaching. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure you're subscribed to the Find Your Freedom podcast on whatever app you're using to listen to this episode. Do me a favor and also leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Go to 20free.co/iTunes to be redirected to the page on Apple Podcasts where you can leave your rating and review. I really appreciate it. If you think this episode would help someone you know, please share it with a friend. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Find Your Freedom podcast. My name is Becky. You can connect with me on Instagram and Twitter at 20freeco and sign up for free resources and email updates at www.20free.co. That's the word 20, free.co. I'll talk to you next week on another episode of the Find Your Freedom podcast.